The day Arthur confessed his feelings to the beautiful transfer student, everyone expected Lyra to break down, to rush over and try to stop him, weeping and protesting. But until the confession was over, Lyra didn't appear. Arthur didn't know that at that moment, Lyra was wearing his roommate's hoodie, sitting innocently on his roommate's bed and asking, "I've gotten your sheets wet. Where am I going to sleep tonight?" Silas looked away, his Adam's apple bobbing, and tossed her a towel. "Go dry your hair. I'll change the sheets, then you can sleep." Arthur was going to confess to that beautiful transfer student. He'd asked everyone to keep it a secret from Lyra beforehand. What he didn't know was that some busybodies had already blabbed to her. Everyone knew that Lyra was head over heels for Arthur and dreamt of marrying him. This time Arthur was truly smitten with the girl at first sight. She was so gorgeous that everyone knew this time it was serious. It was expected that Lyra would make a scene, throw a fit, and perhaps even threaten something drastic. No one could resist watching such a dramatic love triangle. They were all waiting for Lyra to break down and cause a big commotion. But to their disappointment, Arthur's confession was successful, and Lyra was nowhere to be seen. The spectators, gathered in layers, began to feel a little bored. Even Arthur's face didn't betray much happiness. He embraced his new girlfriend and took out his phone. There were no calls or messages. Arthur frowned slightly. Then he addressed the crowd. "Drinks are on me tonight, everyone's invited." The classmates cheered. Lyra, who had been hiding behind the bushes, finally stepped out. Some sharp-eyed person spotted her and immediately shouted, "It's Lyra! Lyra's here!" "I knew it. There's no way Lyra could have resisted coming here." Arthur abruptly looked up. At that moment, the corners of his lips twitched almost imperceptibly. Lyra ignored the people who were waiting for a scene. She walked directly up to Arthur. "Lyra," Arthur said, holding his new girlfriend closer. He looked at her, his voice flat. "Emotions can't be forced. We've known each other for over a decade. I don't want to say anything hurtful to damage our past friendship. From now on, I'll still see you as a little sister. If you need anything, you can still come to me." He lowered his voice, adding, "With so many people watching, don't cause a scene. Just go home." "Arthur," Lyra interrupted him, taking a step forward. He frowned again. "Lyra, listen to me." Lyra smiled and handed him the bracelet she had just taken off her wrist. "I'm here to return this to you." Seeing the bracelet, Arthur's expression turned grim. "Lyra, what trick are you playing now? Take the bracelet back, and I won't bother you anymore." Arthur stared at her intently, his voice colder. "I don't care about such a small amount of money. If I don't want it, I'll just throw it away." As soon as he finished speaking, Lyra turned and tossed the bracelet into a nearby trash can. "You can throw away all the other things I gave you as well." She didn't look at him again as she turned to leave. Arthur stood there, not moving until Lyra was out of sight. His face was still dark. The people around him tried to smooth things over. "Oh, Lyra is just putting on a show. She's trying to save face. You'll see, Arthur, she'll regret this before the night's over. Maybe she'll even come back crying to search the trash can." Arthur chuckled. "Let her do what she wants. If it wasn't for our parents knowing each other, I wouldn't bother dealing with her." All right, stop getting worked up. We have to celebrate tonight." "Don't let her ruin the mood," another friend said. Arthur glanced at his beautiful new girlfriend beside him and pushed Lyra's annoying face to the back of his mind. Anyway, tomorrow Lyra would act as if nothing happened, waiting for him downstairs at the dorm, clinging to him as they went to class. He had seen this act too many times over the years. By the time she reached the river, it was raining heavily. Lyra stood in the rain under her umbrella, thinking about the dream she had had recently. In her dream, because of Arthur's confession to Vivian, Lyra had caused a scene, crying and making a fuss. In an attempt to force him to break up with Vivian that very night, she jumped into this river. And what was the result? She almost lost her life. Arthur only stayed at the hospital for 5 minutes before coldly leaving. The Jiang family, who had taken her in, was embarrassed by her suicidal behavior. Due to Arthur's attitude, they felt she had lost all her value and forced her to drop out of school. They sent her back to her gambling, womanizing, and generally terrible birth parents. Her life went downhill from there and she died a miserable death in a foreign country. The one who collected her mangled body was, ironically, the one she had always distanced herself from and feared. And Arthur, meanwhile, was newly married, happy and thriving. He never even appeared. Over these past few days, the events from her dreams had come true. If not for those dreams, she would have been frantically calling Arthur by now. She would be threatening to jump into the river and forcing him to take her back. She was grateful for those dreams. It was like being reborn, and she could slowly change her miserable fate. The third time she dialed the number, it was finally answered. Lyra gripped her phone tightly, holding it to her ear. She hesitated over those 3 words, Silas, before finally uttering them slowly. The heavy rain cut off the noise of the world. Only Silas' voice, lazy and deep, came over the line. Lyra. Silas, it's raining really hard. I'm at the river and can't get back. Can you come pick me up? There was silence on the other end of the line for a few seconds. She gripped the umbrella handle nervously, her palms damp with sweat. In the dream, when Silas collected her body, he had cried. His tears had fallen onto her decaying flesh and bones, and even in her dream, she had felt the burning sensation. Afterward, he had carried a small urn of her ashes with him for the rest of his life, living alone. Tears welled up and Lyra choked back a sob. Why are you crying? Silas' voice broke through her thoughts. It was still apathetic, bordering on impatient. It's not like I said I wouldn't come. When will you be here? Wait. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Okay, I'll wait for you, Silas. He didn't say anything else. The phone went dead. 15 minutes later, Lyra gave her umbrella to a mother and child taking shelter. By the time Silas arrived, she was completely soaked. He got out of the car, his lips a thin line, his face cold as frost. Lyra pushed the wet hair out of her face, smiled at him brightly and said, Silas, you're right on time. Lyra, you might as well just be an idiot and die, he said coldly, grabbing her arm and shoving her into the car. He tossed her a soft blanket. Dry yourself off and don't get my car dirty. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, then turned the car around smoothly. Okay, she mumbled and wrapped the blanket around herself. She couldn't resist stealing glances at him as he focused on driving. When he wasn't showing any emotion, he always looked aloof and unapproachable. Many girls at school liked him, but no one dared to confess to him. He was Arthur's roommate. She often visited Arthur's dorm, and Silas always seemed annoyed by her. Even now, though he had come to pick her up, his attitude was still cold. The way he shoved her into the car, it had been with such force. Her wrist was still hurting with a red mark. You couldn't tell he had always secretly liked her. Lyra lowered her lashes. Everything from her dream was happening exactly as she remembered. But now, due to her changes, many things were different. Would Silas still like her? If he didn't like her at all, wouldn't she just be causing him trouble? Back to the dorm? Silas suddenly glanced at her. Her heart skipped a beat, and she blurted out, Yeah, back to your dorm. Silas, who was gripping the steering wheel, scoffed. Arthur won't be back tonight. I know. She was clenching the edge of the blanket, twisting it little by little. I'm not looking for him. The car suddenly braked hard on the side of the road. Silas turned to look at her, the coldness in his eyes sending shivers down her spine. Lyra, don't you dare include me in your little games. I'm not. He looked at her for a moment, then took out his phone. I'll call you a cab. Go back yourself. Silas. She bit her lip, grabbing his phone from him. He stared at her, and his eyes were devoid of anger or disgust. They were just dark and filled with complex emotions. Suddenly, she felt an inexplicable sadness. Silas, I don't want to go back to the dorm. They will all laugh at me. I don't dare go home either. Can I stay in your dorm for one night? Of course, if you really hate me, if you really don't want to see me, then never mind. As she finished speaking, tears welled up and rolled down her cheeks silently. Silas didn't say another word. He started the car again. The car drove in the direction of the school, eventually stopping in front of his dorm. Lyra followed Silas into his room. He went to the closet and took out a clean hoodie, handing it to her. The The bathroom is that way. His hoodie was long and big on her. It almost came down to her knees like a dress. After showering, she wore the hoodie out and walked out, her legs bare. Silas looked at her, then immediately looked away. She walked past Arthur's bed to sit on his, her wet hair dripping water and quickly soaking through the sheets. Her shampoo and body wash smelled just like Silas. The same scent filled the small space, and an unspoken and growing intimacy permeated the air. Silas took out his cigarette case, cleared his throat lightly and said, "I'm going out for a smoke." He went to the balcony. Lyra, feeling a little curious, looked around at Silas' bed. The light gray sheets and comforter were clean and tidy. His desk was also tidy, with a computer and books. Lyra was just about to check the decorations on his desk when her phone suddenly started ringing. On the screen was Arthur's name. She didn't answer. It started ringing again and again with no signs of stopping. She finally put the phone on silent and back into her bag. "Silas," she called towards the balcony. He turned around quickly, put out the cigarette and came back inside. "What's wrong?" She was sitting on his bed, and she had to look up to meet his gaze. Silas made eye contact for 2 seconds, then looked away. However, she noticed that his earlobes seemed slightly red. "I got your sheets wet. Where am I going to sleep tonight?" He glanced at her, then at the damp patches on the sheets. His Adam's apple bobbed as he turned around to get a towel for her. "Go dry your hair first. I'll change the sheets and then you can sleep." After saying this, he retrieved a set of clean sheets from his closet. She gripped the towel, remembering how red his ears had been, and couldn't help but smile. By the time she finished drying her hair, Silas had already changed the sheets. "You should go to bed. What about you?" He pulled out the chair, not looking at her. "I'm going to play a game." "Okay," she replied, feeling somewhat disappointed as she sat down on his bed. Silas took out his headset and was about to put it on when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, then looked back at her before answering the call. "Arthur, what's up?" Lyra's heart tightened, and she held her breath instinctively. "Yeah, I'm in the dorm. You said someone saw Lyra coming to our dorm building?" Silas turned back to look at her again. In her haste, she interrupted him. She got up and went to him, straddling his lap and wrapping her arms around his neck. As he started to push her away, she pressed close to his ear. "Silas, say I'm not here." Underneath her fingers, the skin of Silas' neck instantly burned hot. She could see the pale blue veins of his neck, tight and prominent. His Adam's apple was moving up and down, his heart pounding fast and hard. She looked up at him, he looked down at her. And in his eyes was a growing desire. "No, I've been in the dorm. She didn't come." "Yeah, you should ask someone else," Silas said, then ended the call abruptly. He threw his phone aside, his long fingers gripping her waist through the hoodie. He pulled her close, pushing her into his chest. Lyra could clearly feel the hot volcano rising beneath her. A buzzing exploded in her ears, and her first instinct was to get away. But Silas only held her tighter. "Lyra," he said, his voice hoarse. His hot breath landed on her ears and neck. Lyra recoiled, trying to evade him, but his lips pressed onto hers. "Don't tempt me. I don't want to touch you here." Lyra shifted her body slightly, wanting to adjust her position. The volcano seemed like it was about to erupt, fiercely terrifying. During a break to catch her breath, she finally found a chance to speak. "If you don't want to touch me, then why did you kiss me?" Silas lowered his head slightly, forehead resting against hers. Their breaths mingled as he closed his eyes, seemingly trying hard to calm down. "And also, do you even know how to kiss? My lips are all swollen." Silas didn't open his eyes. Only his hands holding her waist loosened slightly. His fingers were long and strong. They were pressing into the small of her back through the hoodie, both painful and agonizing. She couldn't help but frown, wanting to push his hands away. But instead, Silas held her fingers in his. "Lyra, don't move," he murmured. "I'll be gentler this time." When he finished speaking, Silas's hands moved to her lower back. She was pressed into his chest, completely flush against him. This kiss was long but soft and gentle. But near the end he seemed to lose control, kissing her deeply. Lyra tapped him lightly, and during a pause to breathe, opened her mouth and bit him. Silas's voice was hoarse beyond measure. His entire body tensed. The heat from his palm seemed to be melting her. Silas suddenly buried his face in her neck, letting out a low groan. The volcano had erupted, then it calmed. But soon it seemed on the verge of eruption once more. But then Silas pushed her gently away and pulled her to her feet. Lyra found his expression very strange. There was also an unfamiliar scent in the air. She couldn't help but ask, "Silas, what was that just now?" His ears were bright red. This usually aloof and cold man now had eyes filled with a deep desire. "I'm going to take a shower," he said. He stood up, his eyes lowered, and pulled the messy hem of the hoodie on her down. "You should go to bed." Before Lyra could say anything, Silas hurried into the bathroom. As the sound of water filled the room, Lyra flopped onto Silas's bed, rolling around. She used the back of her hand to cool her burning cheeks. She seemed to have a vague idea of what might have just happened. But Silas was tall and worked out often with a body full of lean muscles. The bridge of his nose was high and straight, his jawline sharp. His fingers were long and strong. He didn't seem at all like the type of guy who would finish so quickly. Had he not had a girlfriend before? Or been intimate with a girl before? As she was thinking this, her heart began to swell with bubbly, sweet feelings. Lyra rested her head on Silas's pillow and unexpectedly found a pearl earring tucked beneath it. The earring looked very familiar. It was one of her favorites, the pair she often wore. Once, when she was at Arthur's dorm, she had lost one by accident. She had looked everywhere for it but never found it. So it was Silas who had picked it up. She suddenly remembered that in her previous dreams, this earring had always seemed to be with Silas. She sat there in a daze for a while, before putting the earring back under the pillow. The sound of the hairdryer stopped. When Silas came out, he was wearing a set of navy blue pajamas. After the steam from the shower, his skin looked white like jade. His hair fell smoothly, making him look less harsh and cold than usual. For some reason, she thought Silas looked a little well-behaved at this moment. She was just about to call him when they heard faint voices outside the door. Lyra's expression shifted, and she froze. One of the voices outside the door was clearly Arthur's. Silas's face also darkened, but he reacted quicker than her. By the time Arthur pushed the door open, Lyra's clothes were already tucked into the closet. Her shoes were hidden under the bed all the way in the back. Silas was pulling the covers over himself. The dorm was only lit by a night light, the light dim and soft. Lyra was hidden under Silas's blanket. The barely discernible movement was the only indication that she was there. Even if Arthur came close without a thorough look, he wouldn't see anything out of the ordinary. "Why are the lights off so early?" Arthur asked, curious. "I got caught in the rain and have a headache," Silas answered, as he gently held the restless wrist under the covers. The bed was only 4 feet wide, and with Silas being so tall, he took up a lot of space. Lyra's whole body was pressed up against him. Her soft breath brushed against his side and she could feel the muscles of his abdomen tighten. "All right." Arthur didn't turn the light on. He sat on a chair, took out his phone and started making calls. He tried a few times but no one answered. Arthur became visibly irritated. "Silas, do you think Lyra is doing this on purpose?" "What?" "I just confessed to Vivian today, and she's trying to make things difficult for me. The news just reported a college student committed suicide by jumping into a river because of a love affair. I thought it was her, so I dropped everything and rushed over there. But it wasn't her. I've been calling her all night and she's not answering. She's not even showing her face." Arthur slammed his phone down on the desk. "She's doing this on purpose, deliberately trying to ruin my date tonight." Then Arthur laughed coldly. "I swear she's going to cling to me for the rest of her life." "Maybe not," Silas unexpectedly interjected. Arthur was a little surprised. "Maybe not? Silas, you've seen how she's been clinging to me these past 2 years. You also find her annoying. You've never been nice to her." Hearing this, Lyra couldn't help but bite Silas's side. He flinched, reaching out to stop her with his hand, but his fingers brushed against her lips. She simply bit his finger lightly. Silas's entire body stiffened suddenly, and he hissed out a low sound. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, leg cramps." Silas's voice was very hoarse. After he finished speaking, he coughed a few times. "Fine, you should rest. I won't bother you." Arthur got up. "I'm going to the bathroom and then I'll leave." As he pushed open the bathroom door, Lyra suddenly thought of something. Earlier, when she had taken a shower, she had washed her socks. They were still hanging up in the bathroom to dry. As she expected, 2 minutes later when Arthur came out, he had a mischievous smile on his face. "Silas, have you got a girl in here? You've been hiding it well. Which beautiful girl has finally gotten our pure, aloof Silas?" "Don't talk nonsense." Arthur walked closer to the bed. "Going to bed this early? Are you hiding someone under those covers?" "Arthur," Silas said sternly. Okay, I won't go over there." Arthur stopped, but glanced at Silas's bed with interest. "Do you have any condoms? I have some extra. Do you want them?" Silas, while under the blanket, gently held Lyra's neck, making her stay still on top of him. Then he looked at Arthur, his voice cold. "Don't joke around about girls like that." "Are you serious?" Arthur was surprised. Silas's lips tightened. His Adam's apple bobbed. "Yeah." If the light was a bit brighter, Arthur would have seen the restrained, uncomfortable look on his face. After all, he was holding her neck, not allowing her to move. But she was free to move her hands. Under the covers where no one could see. So she moved her hands and explored Silas' abs. Every time she touched, his muscles would tense. Then she moved a bit lower, and when she reached his V-line, Silas reacted strongly. He had scared her. "Okay then. I won't disturb you. I'm sleeping out tonight," Arthur said pointedly, giving Silas's bed one last glance. But secretly he was looking down on him. He seemed to not be interested in women and treated them coldly. Now it seemed he was not a pure and abstinent figure after all. If he was not wrong, there was a girl hiding under Silas's blankets. Silas was playing the field. But Arthur didn't call him out. He and Silas were on decent terms. Silas was more popular with the girls than he was, which annoyed him a bit. But otherwise the two were on good terms. Arthur turned and left the dorm. As soon as the door was closed, Lyra threw off the blanket. "Silas, I was about to suffocate." Silas leaned against the headboard, his gaze fixed on her. The soft light fell on his handsome features, casting deep shadows. Lyra found herself staring in a daze. They said that beauty was more beautiful under a light. It was the same for men. Seeing a handsome guy in the soft light made for a more romantic setting. Silas slowly got up. He reached out to brush the messy hair from her ear, then cupped her face and said very seriously, "I'm not annoyed by you. I also have never been mean to you. You don't have to take his words to heart." After Silas finished speaking, he let go. He threw back the covers and got out of bed. "You should sleep now." "What about you, Silas?" He picked up his cigarettes and pointed to the balcony. "I'll have a smoke and then sleep." At that moment, Lyra suddenly sneezed. Silas stopped. Lyra grabbed his sleeve, looking at him with pitiful eyes. "I think I'm getting a cold, my head really hurts." Silas looked at her for a moment. "Let go of my sleeve first. I'll get you some medicine." After taking the medicine, Lyra still wouldn't let go of him. "Silas, I'm a little cold. The blanket is too thin." But this time Silas pushed her hands away. "Lyra, Arthur left a while ago. You don't have to do this anymore." "What does it have to do with him?" Silas laughed self-deprecatingly. "What were you doing at the river tonight?" Lyra realized what had happened. So, the news Arthur mentioned about a girl jumping into the river had made him misunderstand. He thought she had gone to the river because she wanted to commit suicide. That calling him and returning to the dorm with him was for revenge against Arthur. She knew that it was normal for him to think this way. These past 2 years her adoptive parents had been pressuring her. After the true heiress of the Jiang family had returned, they had tried to send Lyra back to her birth parents. Later they had realized she still had some value, and barely allowed her to stay. So for her, Arthur was like a lifeline. She had thought that as childhood friends they would have some connection. that he would pull her out of the mud. She had put all her hopes on Arthur. But all of this, in others' eyes, was proof of her crazy love for him. Not to mention Silas. He must have witnessed her clingy and obsessed moments. She wanted to explain, but he had already stood up. Set your alarm and leave early tomorrow so no one will see you. After all, these things aren't good for you girls. But he didn't stop and he didn't look back. Lyra bit her lip. Then why did you kiss me so many times tonight? And do that just now. Aren't you going to take responsibility? Silas stopped suddenly. He turned to look at her. Lyra was sitting on the bed, her eyes red, but she was forcing herself not to cry. I know you hate me. Before, every time I came here you ignored me. But tonight, thank you for picking me up and letting me stay. If you really don't want to have anything to do with me, then I'll leave right now. She got out of bed. Not even finding her shoes. She started walking out in her bare feet. As she walked past Silas with her head down, she couldn't stop the tears from falling. Silas grabbed her. I said before I don't hate you. Then will you take responsibility? Lyra shook off his hand and looked up at him defiantly. You kissed me, hugged me, and did all that just now. Silas suddenly grabbed her chin and kissed her hard. His lips covered hers, his breathing grew heavier. If you insist on provoking me, then you should provoke me completely. Lyra wrapped her arms around his trim waist and reached up to meet the deep kiss. Okay. During the 11-day holiday, Lyra went to the city where her biological parents lived. She stayed there for 3 days. When she left, those good-for-nothing gamblers and drunkards were taken away by the police, awaiting the strict judgment of the law. Trafficking, gambling, and forcing others into prostitution. Thanks to her dreams, she had solid proof of everything. She did not need to wait for reincarnation or her next life. This life, she would completely get rid of these demons and make them pay. When the plane took off, she breathed a long sigh of relief. The biggest problem in her heart had been settled. At that moment, she felt an unparalleled sense of freedom and relief. When the plane landed in the capital, she first sent Silas a message letting him know that she had arrived safely. During this trip, Silas had not known what she was really doing. He thought that she was simply traveling with a friend for a few days. I'll come see you tonight. Have you finished cleaning the house? Silas had moved into a house off campus. He was a senior and rarely needed to return to school. Also, it was not so convenient to live in the same dorm as Arthur. I have finished cleaning. I'll go pick you up. Okay. What's wrong? Today is Arthur's birthday. He's organizing something and asked me to go with my girlfriend. She had forgotten that Arthur's birthday was during the national holiday. Lyra, do you want to come with me? Lyra did not answer, feeling a lot of inner turmoil. It wasn't that she was unwilling to make her relationship with Silas public. It was that the Jiang family would probably soon disown her. When that happened, her shameful background would be revealed to the whole world. She knew that Silas wouldn't care. But she didn't want him to be ridiculed. Just like in her dream where they accused him of being unfilial and hurting his family for being with an unworthy woman. But, just like what Silas had said, that it was she who had provoked him, she should provoke him completely. People couldn't have it both ways. Lyra took a deep breath. Do you want me to go? Yes, he answered without hesitation. Then you should come pick me up. I'll go with you. She held her phone and glanced up, seeing her face in the glass window. As she spoke those words, she was smiling a radiant smile. Lyra, look outside. Her heart seemed to stop for a moment. As she turned, it was like a slow-motion scene from a movie. Her smile was still radiant and the electronic announcement seemed to fade away like a retreating tide. In the bustling crowd, she saw Silas. She only saw Silas. Lyra dropped her suitcase and ran towards him without a second thought. Silas stood still, but he opened his arms wide. She threw herself into his arms and he caught her steady and firm. Such a strong impact, yet he hadn't taken even a single step backward. She wrapped her arms around his neck and looked up at him, her face bright with happiness. Wow, your core strength is so good. He looked down at her and smiled softly. My waist is also good, do you want to try? Lyra poked his hard abs and laughed softly into his ear. It's just a little fast. Lyra. He sounded helpless, yet was full of youth and vigor, not willing to be outdone. You just wait. Don't beg for mercy, crying won't help you. Tonight's birthday party, as usual, was for a large group of people that Arthur had invited. Vivian was especially dressed up tonight, breathtakingly beautiful. The two sitting together was a pleasing sight. Vivian was flattered by the compliments she received from several girls. She couldn't help but look at Arthur, but he seemed a little distracted. Arthur. Vivian called him a few times before he finally snapped back. What's wrong? It's getting late, everyone's hungry. What's the rush? Not everyone is here yet. Who else is missing? Yeah, who else is coming? Silas hasn't arrived yet. Oh, that's right. Lyra hasn't arrived yet either. Will Lyra come? It's Arthur's birthday. Lyra won't miss this day. Arthur suddenly interrupted everyone. I didn't invite her. Even if she comes, I won't let her in. Arthur, don't be angry, today's your birthday. Vivian hurriedly soothed him gently. Don't let unimportant people spoil the mood, okay? You're right. Arthur looked at his girlfriend beside him. Vivian was truly very beautiful. Lyra was also pretty, but not with this kind of bright and alluring beauty. That was why he had been drawn to Vivian at first sight. However, after getting her, he had realized that she was nothing special. In the past month, Lyra hadn't waited for him downstairs at the dorm building. She hadn't clung to him as they went to class or the cafeteria. She had suddenly disappeared from his world. Even when they occasionally ran into each other at school, she would turn away to avoid him. Arthur had to admit that he wasn't used to it. Yes, he attributed all of this to habit. He was simply not used to someone who had always revolved around him suddenly being cold. He would never love Lyra. Even less, for the sake of this fake heiress, risk angering his elders. But after all, they had known each other for so many years. Arthur thought tonight, if Lyra couldn't resist and came back to him, he wouldn't even need her to lower her head and beg. As long as she teared up a few times with red eyes, he would leave a place for her in his world. The door to the private room was suddenly pushed open. Guess who I just saw? The boy who came in looked gossipy, but his eyes were on Arthur. Who? Don't keep us waiting. Yeah, who is it? Surely it's not Lyra. Actually, it is Lyra. Arthur, we told you Lyra can't live without you. Look, she just couldn't resist, even for tonight. Arthur didn't speak, but the sullen expression on his face clearly faded. Vivian's face changed. She lightly tugged Arthur's sleeve and whispered, sounding somewhat aggrieved. Arthur, can you make Lyra leave? She chased you for so long before, it makes me feel awkward. Arthur looked at Vivian, and suddenly felt that she looked much more pleasing now. His mood also mysteriously improved. However, Lyra's actions these past few months had made him quite angry. Even if he decided to forgive her now, he had to punish her. Okay, let her leave then, Arthur said casually, patting Vivian's cheek. Who are you telling to leave? The half-open door was pushed open further, and Silas strode in. His voice wasn't loud, but it sounded firm. There was an indescribable sense of authority. The huge room suddenly went silent, because everyone saw that Silas was followed by a girl, and that girl was Lyra. Arthur remained seated, but the wine glass he was toying with suddenly shattered. Vivian shrieked in fear. Blood, Arthur, you're bleeding. Get out. Arthur. I said get out, can't you understand? Arthur suddenly stood up, throwing the shattered glass down violently. Vivian was stunned. For a while before she burst into tears and ran out. The others in the private room also understood the situation and quickly left. Arthur's hand was hanging by his side, the blood dripping onto the floor. But he didn't seem to feel the pain. He just stared at Silas. After a while he pointed at Lyra. Silas, don't you want to explain? The fingers hidden under Silas' sleeve were held even tighter. His fingers were dry and strong, giving her an indescribable sense of security. Explain what? Why did Lyra come with you? You invited me to bring my girlfriend to your birthday party. Did you forget? Silas held Lyra's hand, pulled her to his side, and wrapped his arm around her. Arthur seemed like a beast that had been instantly enraged. With his bloody hand he picked up the nearest glass and threw it on the ground. Silas, do you even know that Lyra is mine? Yours? Girlfriend? Or fiancé? Silas didn't back down. Or does a girl who liked you automatically become your private property? Arthur's eyes were bloodshot. You knew that Lyra liked me and you still dared to steal her from me? Arthur, he didn't steal anything. Lyra squeezed Silas' hand and looked at Arthur. It was my choice. Also, I don't like you. Well, I probably stopped liking you a long time ago. She looked at him and realized that she had already let go. After all, any girl with self-respect would not like someone who had never respected her. Nor would she like someone who was cold and indifferent and treated her as a doormat. Maybe those years growing up together had made her develop some hazy feelings. But after her identity was exposed and his attitude changed, those feelings had long since disappeared. Lyra, what are you saying? Arthur seemed to have heard something unbelievable. You almost jumped into the river for me, and now you're saying you don't like me? I never thought of jumping into the river for you. I went to the river that night only to find a reason for Silas to pick me up. Arthur suddenly froze. After a while he stared at her, his eyes wide with rage, and enunciated each word slowly. So that night in the dorm, the person in Silas' bed was you? That's right, it was me. Arthur, just focus on your relationship. I said that day that I would never bother you again. And I will never go back on my word. After saying this, Lyra didn't look at him again, pulling Silas away. Silas, let's go home. I want to see what the new place is like. But Silas did not move. He looked at Arthur, his gaze calm but filled with a piercing pressure. Arthur, I don't want to hear anyone disparaging my girlfriend in the future. Arthur had completely lost control and was saying things without thinking. Silas, who the hell do you think you are? Silas only smiled coldly. If you are unclear about who I am, why don't you go home and ask your father? Arthur suddenly quieted down. His gaze slowly moved from Silas's face to hers. His handsome face now had an indescribable look of rage. Silas doesn't know that you aren't the real Zhang family's heiress, right? It's quite a big deal to be keeping from him. Wouldn't you agree? Even though Lyra was prepared for her background to be exposed, she still felt some awkwardness and unease at having it revealed so suddenly. The hand being held by Silas instantly grew stiff and cold. Her palms were sweating layer upon layer. Seeing her face turn pale, Arthur laughed. See, you were indeed hiding it from him. I knew it. If Silas found out about your background, he would avoid you at all costs. Even if you were offered up to him on a silver platter, he wouldn't touch you. Silas suddenly let go of her hand. His face expressionless, he rolled up his sleeves and took off his watch, handing it to her. I always thought you were just an unfaithful playboy, not a good person but not downright evil. But now I realize. Silas took a step forward, grabbed Arthur's collar, and slammed him against the wall. You are not only a despicable scum, but also a coward and a failure. Arthur was furious and tried to fight back, but Silas punched him hard in the face. Also, Arthur, I'm not like you. I don't love a certain Zhang family, heiress, or a Zhao family heiress. I love only Lyra. If she's called Lyra, I love Lyra. If she's called Zhao, I'll love Zhao. It's as simple as that. But Lyra is no longer pure. Before he could finish speaking, Silas punched him in the face again. Arthur cried out in pain, covered his bloody face, and fell to the ground in a mess. Lyra was afraid that Silas would cause a death if he continued, so she rushed over and grabbed him tightly. Silas, don't fight anymore, something bad will happen. Silas' face was cold, but he stopped. He looked at the bloodied Arthur, took out his phone, made a call to have someone take care of the aftermath, then wrapped his arm around her. Lyra, let's go home. As they reached the car, Lyra suddenly stopped him. Silas, do you believe me? She looked up at Silas. He was wearing a dark gray shirt, looking cold, elegant, and exceptionally handsome. Seeing him angry and fighting made her used to hide away, and very scared before. However, now she felt an incomparable warmth. All those years she had desperately tried to grasp at a lifeline, but always failed. The elders who had once doted on her no longer saw her as their precious jewel, though they never hit or scolded her. Their arrogant and distant coldness was enough to cause a teenager to fall apart. Her childhood sweetheart looked down on her from the bottom of his heart. Her biological parents were just money-grubbing demons. Every day and night she lived in fear of being sent back to them, where she would suffer for all eternity. And until her death, she hadn't known that someone had secretly loved her for so long. Luckily, everything from her dreams wouldn't happen again. She did not fall into despair, or try to tie down Arthur with her body. Nothing happened between me and Arthur. Lyra. Silas cupped her face and kissed her. She gripped his sleeve tightly, her fingers clenching and unclenching. Silas. When his kisses had made her breathless, her legs had grown so weak that she could only hug him tightly. Silas's kisses moved to her neck. Lyra, I don't care about those things. But hearing you say it makes me happy. You know, men are always a little selfish in this way. I know, Silas. I'm telling you these things just so that he won't tarnish my reputation. I'm doing it for you but also for myself. Then she smiled at him and snuggled into his coat. Silas, let's go home, I'm freezing. Okay. He took her hand and held it tight. And that hold would last for a lifetime. Before her relationship with Silas was completely public, Lyra went to the Zhang family and talked to her elders for an entire afternoon. Finally, under the mediation of the real heiress Zhang Rong, she regained her guardianship rights. From that moment she had no ties to the Zhang family. She chose that particular moment because she understood the people of the Zhang family. If they knew of her relationship with Silas, they would cling to the Liang family like leeches. And she didn't want Silas and the Liang family to be bothered by that. When Lyra left the Zhang family, Mrs. Zhang was quite displeased. Lyra, our family raised you for so many years and spent millions on you. We haven't received a single penny in return. Actually, her mindset had changed completely. The Zhang family had raised her as their precious jewel for 16 years, until the real Miss Zhang came back. She had indeed had a few years of anguish, but at least she hadn't gone hungry. And there was Zhang Rong, who had once been full of malice towards her. Now she had suddenly changed her attitude. It seemed that the reason Lyra had been forced to drop out of school and sent back to her birth parents was because of Zhang Rong. And yet now she was the one who had spoken up for her and helped to settle the last concern in her heart. She had also persuaded Mrs. Zhang not to spread her shameful background to everyone. The current Lyra was free and at peace. There was no one and nothing left that could bind her. She was content. Madam. Lyra bowed respectfully to Mrs. Zhang. I will never forget your kindness. You talk so sweetly. Mrs. Zhang glanced at her coldly. You can't even handle a childhood sweetheart like Arthur. What kind of success can you achieve in the future? Fine, just leave quickly. Seeing you makes me feel upset. Mrs. Zhang waved her hand dismissively. Lyra didn't try to explain anymore. She just gave Zhang Rong a look. Mom, let me walk Lyra out, Zhang Rong said, and Mrs. Zhang's expression softened. Come back quickly, we need to eat dinner. I understand. Zhang Rong smiled and taking Lyra's hand, she led her out of the living room. They walked into the garden before stopping. Looking at each other, they both smiled. Sister, Lyra said gently, thank you. At the same time that she was speaking, Zhang Rong also whispered, Lyra, I'm sorry. There were many things they hadn't said, but they both knew and understood each other. Zhang Rong's apology was for the Lyra from the dreams. Lyra's eyes turned red and Zhang Rong also teared up. Finally, she squeezed Lyra's hand tightly. Lyra, this time you must be very happy, very happy. I will, sister, you too. She would repay the kindness of the Zhang family in a different way through Zhang Rong. She had suffered for 16 years, and she had enjoyed 16 years of her good fortune. In her dreams she had hated her, but now all of the past was gone. When Silas took Lyra to meet his parents, to be honest, she was quite nervous. For some reason, Mrs. Liang had started practicing Buddhism a few years ago, and every year she would go to the Pajia temple to burn incense. Don't be nervous. My mother has been practicing Buddhism and has become very kind, and my father, well, he always listens to her. Silas seemed to sense her nervousness and tried to reassure her, but the closer they got, the more nervous she became. Silas, how about another day? I'm scared. She stopped, grabbing his sleeve and refusing to go forward. Lyra, Silas shook his head helplessly. Mom is already out to meet us. Sure enough, Mrs. Liang had already come down the steps and was walking towards the car. Lyra could only bite the bullet and follow Silas. Mom, this is Lyra. Auntie, hello. I am Lyra. Lyra quickly greeted her politely, handing over the gifts she had prepared. Mrs. Liang smiled and accepted the gifts, but her gaze was fixed on her. Even when they had gone inside, Mrs. Liang was still staring at her. Then she abruptly pulled her upstairs. To her study. Lyra was a little scared and looked at Silas for help. However, Mrs. Liang held Lyra's hand. Don't be afraid, Lyra, let's go upstairs and talk a little. She turned to tease Silas with a smile. Don't be nervous, your mother is not going to eat your girlfriend. Lyra's face flushed. Auntie. Mrs. Liang looked like she was in a very good mood and held Lyra's hand tightly. Look at Lyra, she's just like I said, beautiful and lovely. Mr. Liang was a very elegant and gentle gentleman. He nodded at his wife's words. Yes, indeed, very beautiful and lovely. She seems like a good girl. Lyra was confused and didn't know what was happening. Mrs. Liang held her hand, her eyes slightly red. Lyra, don't misunderstand. It's a little ridiculous, but all these years I keep having the same dream. In the dream, Silas never married for the sake of a girl. He went alone at just over 40. At first, me and his father didn't believe it. We just thought it was just a dream. But later, the other events in my dream came true. Mrs. Liang's tears began to fall. I've been practicing Buddhism these past few years for Silas's sake. I'm really worried that the end of that dream would become a reality. So I have always thought, if that girl really existed, how wonderful it would be if they could be together. Seeing you now, I know that these years of practicing Buddhism haven't been in vain. Lyra, you and Silas, you have to be together and be happy. Lyra's vision had long since become blurry. In this world there were bad people like her biological parents, but there were also mothers like Mrs. Liang who cared deeply about their sons. What kind of virtue did she possess, that she had been able to meet Silas, and this kind of wonderful family? With that, she had resolved all of the regrets of her dreams. When she graduated from college, Lyra and Silas got their marriage certificate. The wedding was still in the planning stages. She wanted something simple and low-key, but neither Silas nor the Liang family would allow it. But after getting their marriage certificate, Lyra moved into Silas's house. When he went to the bathroom to shower, Lyra found the pearl earring that she had lost before. But this time she didn't put it back, instead she put it on her ear. She only put on that single earring. When Silas came out of the shower, Lyra was lying on his bed, completely covered with his blanket, pretending to be asleep. Lyra! A warm wet kiss landed lightly on her cheek. She felt a little ticklish, her eyelashes fluttered, but she didn't open her eyes. Silas seemed to chuckle softly and kissed her again. Then he pulled back the blanket and froze. Lyra! The soft light of the night lamp cast a gentle glow. It enveloped her whole body, and the pearly luster of the earring shimmered, barely visible. The rise and fall of the blanket created shadows in the light, with patches of black and white, touched by light pink. Like white jade bowls filled with red cherries, it was truly tempting. At first, she felt very shy and nervous, her limbs were stiff. But when she saw how Silas looked, the nervousness suddenly disappeared. She sat up, threw herself into his arms, and wrapped her arms around his neck. Just like that night in his dorm, she whispered into his ear, Silas, do you like it? You're staring. She could feel that all the muscles in his body had tightened. His temperature was rising. His skin felt burning hot, as if his blood was about to boil. His Adam's apple bobbed wildly, and the veins in his neck stood out. She tilted her face, her soft lips brushing against the veins, and finally landed on his Adam's apple, and bit him gently. It was like a floodgate had suddenly opened, or like a volcano that had been dormant for thousands of years had erupted. Silas instantly took the lead, pressing her down on the bed. His kisses were forceful, deep, and heavy. She could barely keep up. She felt like she was about to be crushed. He kept calling her name over and over without tiring. And near the end he kissed her gently. If it hurts, bite me. Lyra closed her eyes and hummed softly. Her nails dug into his back. leaving deep teeth marks on his shoulder. Yet it still hurt. She couldn't help but cry from the pain. She looked at him with teary eyes, feeling a little wronged. He looked so scary. She subconsciously thought that he would not stop, not be able to control himself. But Silas stopped and pulled her into his arms. She hugged his waist and suddenly remembered what had happened at the airport that day. She couldn't help but ask, "Didn't you say I begged for mercy and crying wouldn't help?" The desire in his eyes hadn't faded. Just from his expression, she could tell how much he was trying to control himself. Silas hugged her tightly, his voice hoarse. "I couldn't bear to." When did you start liking me?" But he wouldn't answer. He just held her tighter. "You won't tell me?" Lyra looked up at him but smiled. "Then I won't say that I like you either." Silas suddenly looked at her. Under the overwhelming desire, his eyes showed a vast depth of love. After a long pause, he finally spoke softly. "The first time I saw you, Lyra, I had thought that I wouldn't have a chance to let you know this ever." Lyra's heart suddenly hurt terribly. "It doesn't matter, Silas, we have our whole life to be together now." "Yes, we have our whole life now." Their fingers intertwined. When she looked up to kiss him, he also lowered his head and kissed her tenderly. "Silas, I don't feel the pain anymore. Do you want to continue?" Soon the room was filled with sounds that made one's face flush. Sounds that didn't cease. This night would be long. And even longer was their lifetime. Amidst the tide of passion, let us talk of love deep and shallow. The inn.